Welcome back, everybody, to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. We have a very special guest with us today, a man who basically was in the industry, came into it not as a programmer, not as a technician, but he came in as purely on the business side as you could. A man, if I'm not misquoting his credentials, is an accountant by profession. And he was there at the very dawn, way back in the day, over 40 years ago. And he is going to be telling us a little bit about the history of both Atari and Namco in this industry. So welcome to the show, Kevin Hayes.
Thank you very much, Carl.
So, Kevin, I'm going to plug this right here because it's really good. There'll be a link in the show notes. You just recently gave a very great and in-depth interview to the Ted Dabney Hour about your time at Atari in Ireland. And I need to touch on some of that again, but I will refer everybody to go and listen to that interview as well. I don't want to repeat everything from that one. But just for our listeners, give a brief rundown. How do you end up in the gaming business?
Yeah, purely by accident. I, as you said, I'm an accountant. I'm what they call a chartered accountant. I work for a big company called Pricewaterhouse in Dublin in the late 70s, and from 73 to 77. And then I got a job with, would you believe, a chewing gum manufacturer for a year. That didn't work out too well. And because I hated accounting, regular accounting, auditing at that level. So I looked for a job. I saw a small ad in an Irish newspaper looking for a financial controller for a startup of a company called Atari. There was opening a plant in Tipperary, and I applied for the job and got it. I'm not sure there were many other applicants, but anyway, that's how I began in August 1978.
Now, at that point in time, what was your understanding or knowledge of video games and arcade games, coin-op games going into this?
You know, it was minimal. I mean, as a child, I'd always been around games and the old-fashioned games and seaside arcades in Ireland, you know, kind of the British-style arcades that are also kind of common in Ireland, mainly on the coast and then in central Dublin. But I really didn't know a lot about them. I'd played Pong a few times in bars, I guess in sort of 73, 74, just after it came out. But really, I had no knowledge of it. And when I got laid off from this chewing gum manufacturer, they had a big redundancy thing in 1978. I looked for a few jobs. I got job offers from a couple of companies, and I decided to take Atari, even though it was the lowest salary of three of them because it involved, quote, 2 weeks of training in California. And I thought, that's worth some money. I'll do that. But, I mean, you got to remember, I was 26. I had narrow motivations, if you like. And I got interviewed. I mean, I like the style of the company right from the start. I got interviewed. And if I'm saying too much, Carl, cut me off.
No. Go for it. Go for it.
I got interviewed by a Welshman who had worked for Atari in the United States right at the beginning, ran their manufacturing, and he'd come over to start up a plant in Ireland. His name was Gil Williams. He was a mechanical engineer. And my first interview was in a bar in a hotel in Tipperary town, which is a very small town, you know, less than 5,000 people.
Wow.
And we sat and drank a few beers, and he offered me the job. And I thought, well, this is an unusual style, you know. This is a little bit different to the normal corporate environment. And Atari was kind of like that. Now, subsequently, before the job thing was completed, I had a phone interview with the CFO in California, which was much more serious, but gives you an idea of the kind of style of the company, if you like. And so then I came in as the financial controller. I was like it was Gil, a couple of Americans, and a couple of recently recruited electronic engineers, graduate young men, 22 years old, kind of guys in Tipperary, and it sort of went from there. We started up in 1978 when I joined. The video game business was in a lull. You know, there had been those initial years of Pong and the derivatives of that. And it kind of had sort of scaled down quite a lot. But in late 78, a game called Space Invaders came out. And that sort of changed the whole dynamic. And, we came up with some good games subsequently after that. The plan was to be, it was a pretty small scale plant, 25,000 square feet. God, I can't translate that into European anymore, but you get the idea. It was meant to produce 25 games a day. And that was kind of what we did for the first year. And then Gil Williams, his Californian wife, decided she didn't want to live in Ireland anymore. It had seemed exotic, I guess, at one point to come live in Ireland from California, but after a year there, she had enough, and he went back. And it was still small scale, 25. So they thought, okay, well, let this accountant do it. It's a pretty routine kind of job. And of course, immediately after that we released Asteroids, which was our first really big game of the new sort of Space Invaders era, if you like. And we had to scale up production to a multiple of 5 to 125 a day. And, we went through all that, and very rapidly, as fast as we can, because I always remember in Christmas just after we came back from the Christmas holidays and Christmas 1979, and we were just orders just coming flooding in all the time from the European markets, which is what we were set up to fill, that was our area. And our principal markets were, of course, Germany and the UK. There were lots of other little markets, but the dominant markets, I would say at that point, maybe 80% of our production was going to Germany and to the UK.
Now, and this is where I think getting into the nature of the business at that point. Now, the U.S. is fairly homogenous. You can understand, okay, you're producing in one place, it's one country. Canada's essentially the same thing. Right. What is it like to distribute the games across Europe at that point from a location in Ireland? Because you don't have the EU in the sense we know it today at that point.
No, but you had the EC, so you had a kind of a reasonably easy access to most markets. As usual, the Spanish were difficult. They put up, and the French were too. They put up a lot of trade barriers. But the Germans and the English particularly were very open to it. They didn't really care where they got the stuff from. Atari, by the way, had a sort of a manufacturing relationship with a French company, and they had a kind of a joint venture kind of manufacturing company near Dijon, but that had sort of failed, and for whatever reason they weren't good. Neither of them were good joint venture partners, so they decided to do their own thing and control their own production. And obviously, if you're going to have volume, you can't supply stuff from California. That's a problem in America even, but it's certainly a problem to ship stuff to Europe. They chose Ireland because the Irish government were sort of selling themselves as a good manufacturing base for Europe, and it worked out reasonably well. We had a fairly good airport near us where the stuff would come in from California. When I say this stuff, we were an assembly shop. Yeah, we didn't make the boards. The printed circuit boards, the electronics were made in California, shipped over to us, and some of the specialized controls. Like some of the trackballs and stuff like that it wasn't worth our while tooling up, were all shipped from the United States. We sourced the local cabinetry and wiring looms, wiring harnesses, and various metal things and all that sort of stuff in Ireland.
How about screens? Were those also being shipped in, or were
those were being shipped in? They were being shipped in. It just shows you how long it is now. The first screens we used were black and white Motorola's. Motorola was a kind of big supplier to the industry when I got into it, and of course they fell away subsequently. And we developed various other manufacturers. None of them in Ireland, though. I'm trying to remember now where we got them from. The Asteroids used what they call an XY monitor, and the XY monitor was a specialized monitor developed with a company called Electrohome in Canada. and we used their monitors. And God, I'm blanking out now on who we used. When I started in '78, we were just switching to color. Mostly it had been black and white before that, but it gradually, just sort of in the very late '70s and early '80s, everything went color like almost immediately after the success of Space Invaders.
Gotcha. Well, I was always wondering whether or not there was going to be an issue if it was a normal PAL NTSC type of issue, or if these were actually monitors in the sense of they had their own standard for the resolutions that the board was outputting.
Yeah, I think more the latter. In the early days, of course, there were issues like that, but they subsequently they were stripped down monitors. The very early Atari games, as you know, were TV sets, with various things disabled and everything. But these were monitors built specifically for the business by various manufacturers. Again, my apologies. I'm just 40 years. I can't remember exactly who the other suppliers were. And usually I'm pretty good at that, but that particular point I'm blanking on.
Not a problem. So, and now you're obviously shipping these games out. You have these larger markets. What's the distribution channel system looking like at this point? Does Atari have its own sales reps in different locations? Are they are the sales reps?
We used third party. We had almost no salespeople. In fact, in the early days, in the very first year or two, the Californians were still making the sales to an existing group of sort of coin-op amusement distributors. So those were mostly one-off, privately owned companies in each of the countries. Like, for instance, in Germany, we shipped to a company in Bingen am Rhein, Leuven Automaten, and subsequently later in the cycle, I guess, in the mid '80s, we switched to a company called Nova Apparate in Hamburg. So we had one-off companies, and that was mainly to do with the main salesman moved from the guy that we had a relationship with at Leuven moved to Nova Apparate. These were all companies that were also in the the slot machine business in Germany and all that kind of thing. They operated Spielotheks. That kind of business. Yeah. So.
Leuven is still huge in that business today.
Is it really? Yeah.
Oh yeah. You can't shake a stick without seeing one of their shops. I mean, they're spread out all over the country.
Right, and Leuven was associated with a company called NSM, which was, basically the same ownership. Leuven, I think, was a division of NSM. NSM was a big jukebox manufacturer, among other things.
Atari Ireland is not just restricted to Atari product. At what point did you guys start licensing other products?
When we didn't get enough Atari. I mean, obviously, the preference was to use our own product, obviously, corporate wide. But at various times, like for instance, we licensed games from various manufacturers. A game called Time Pilot from Konami, Mazer Blazer from Stern, and that was a real dog. You probably never heard of that. And
no.
We made a big move into Laserdisc games when they came out in 82, 83 with Dragon's Lair and those products. We negotiated directly with the American manufacturers in California and licensed the thing for Europe. We were chartered with making a profit, so we were given authority to find other sources when, inevitably the video game business was very much a hit and miss business. You could have a game, a lot of effort, and it wouldn't sell at all. So you still had a factory to feed, and you had to keep your volumes up and everything. So, we found third-party suppliers everywhere we could. It was a very small international business, so we dealt with the Japanese, Konami, and with some Namco products as well, of course, And Atari had this relationship with Namco for a long time, dating into the early 70s. So it was a logical choice to team up with them. We made some great pole position from Namco springs to mind. That was a big hit for us sometime there in the 83, 84 period, I think, 85. I don't remember exactly.
Now, how would those relationships have worked? Like you said with Dragon's Lair, you guys were getting the equipment and everything from them.
Yeah.
But how did it work with the Japanese manufacturers? Were you getting the stuff from their American subsidiaries, from their Japanese subsidiaries? How would that work?
My recollection is it was pretty much printed circuit boards from Japan directly in the case of Konami and Namco. We got, yes, that's what it was. And, we did our own cabinetry to suit our own market and our own manufacturing capabilities and everything. But by and large, we tried to copy exactly what they had done. That's what they wanted. There was no specifications like that. All they cared about was, the deals would be done on the basis of, commit to X number of thousand of games up front. And then you took the risk on those. It wasn't on a sale or consignment basis, consignment sale sort of basis. It was you owned them once you bought them, whether, you couldn't sell them or not. That's your business. That was your thing to make them and sell them after that. And they didn't really care.
Gotcha. And so was there ever any worry about buying into a competing product that may have been a conflict with Atari's products?
No, not really. I mean, they were always Atari's. My bosses were always aware of what we were doing. We'd tell them this is what we're going to negotiate on this, and we'd have conversations about it. And they were always understood the deal. And if there were any objections, and I don't recall them ever saying, no, don't buy that one or don't do that one because we have something similar or near it or anything like that. No, not an issue. Never was. And of course, we would only do it if we had a game that we could sell unlimited numbers of that was made by Atari. That was our number one choice for all sorts of reasons. It was just easier for us to do it, less risk, everything else, more profit for the company overall. But sometimes they wouldn't have anything, or they'd have something that wasn't suitable for us, like a baseball game or an NFL football game that had very limited appeal in our markets. So we had to, in fact, and I think about it, that when Space Invaders was big in 78, late 78 onwards, Atari had a game called Football. They didn't like that. It actually wasn't called. They didn't use NFL because NFL wanted too big a license fee for it. But we couldn't sell it in the United States, so the geniuses in California decided to design a game called Soccer, which was using the same kind of trackball type arrangement to play soccer. It didn't work out because soccer isn't that kind of, it doesn't suit the same kind of programming as NFL, if you like. And NFL is a very scripted plays kind of game, whereas soccer is much more creative. So that was kind of a failure. That was sort of a failure for us. But in any case, we used third parties. Atari was mostly always happy with it. Like us, and even more so, they preferred to have games that they could sell to us. But if they couldn't, they knew we had a factory to run and overheads to meet and everything else.
Gotcha. Now, how long did you stay at Atari Ireland?
I stayed until 84, summer of 84. And at this stage, business wasn't so good. The bloom, that big initial rush lasted for a couple of years, sort of late 70s into the early 80s. But by the time I came over in June of 84, and my purpose was Atari in the United States and California had decided to scale back their business, coin up, the big factory that they had that was producing, 500 games a day or whatever. They didn't need it anymore. So they decided, would you believe this, that they would reopen in El Paso, Texas, where the consumer business of Atari, making the VCS, the video computer system, the home game system, they had factories down there in those maquiladora, the cross-border type factories. And they decided they wanted to make a Tipperary in El Paso, if you like, do something similar, lower volume in Tipperary. Well, I got in on a weekend in late June of 1984, and 2 or 3 days later, by the following Monday, the whole company had been sold. Warner Communications in New York, who were the owner, had sold it to Jack Trammell, who was they were from Commodore. They were the company that produced the Commodore PET, one of the original personal computers. But my business, the coin-op business, was cast off. They had no interest in it. So we ended up eventually in the next year as a joint venture of Namco and Warner Communications.
Okay, so because Warner keeps the Atari games, the arcade manufacturer.
Yeah, they go for the Atari Games Inc. is really a joint venture of Namco and Warner Communications.
Ah, okay. And so what was Namco's involvement in this joint venture?
They were financial investors. They were there as just game people that had a relationship with Atari. When they had bought, Namco knew Atari, they had bought the assets of Atari Japan, and I'm not sure because this was all before me, but roughly in the 74, 75, 76 period, Atari had been quite aggressive. It's one of them said once, they had lots of chances to stay small, but they never took them. They were always they were out there. They went into Japan. They started up their own manufacturing. It ended up being a fiasco for reasons that I really don't understand. I wasn't there, and no one seemed to want to talk about it very much. And it was consigned to history. So it's a part of history that I don't really know. That's all. But the point was that there was a relationship between Namco and Atari. And at the time when Namco bought Atari, Namco was a relatively small manufacturer, but it was a fairly big operator of amusement arcade games, and it, of course, used Atari games and others in their arcades.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, so going into this new joint venture, what was going to be your role there?
Well, at that stage, let me just go back and track back a little bit. We abandoned the El Paso idea. For one of the logics of it would be we would have been able to share resources with the consumer games company. Well, then of course we were no longer part of the consumer games company at that point, so there was no prevailing strong logic. So what we did was just we scaled back the existing plant in California and made a smaller Tipperary style plant in Silicon Valley to make the games. And this was in sort of the 85, 86 kind of period. And we had a few good games at that point. Everything went well up until the Atari got into the Atari also got into the supplying games for the Nintendo system that was then coming on strong. And we had a lot of very good titles from the coin-op side that we could convert to the consumer market. But of course, Nintendo was Atari's ownership. Atari Games ownership was sort of dissatisfied with the terms that they had with Nintendo, and they decided that they would kind of stop paying. They would not agree to the terms anymore and just market the stuff directly without paying Nintendo, just to put it crudely. And that developed into a big fight. Namco in Japan didn't like that because they had a relationship with Nintendo that was important to them. They supplied software for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES also. So Namco kind of fell out with Warner about Atari's aggressiveness towards Nintendo in the United States, and that caused a split then, which eventually resolved itself in Namco taking over the coin-op side the arcade side of the Atari's business, which we had started in 1988, running our own arcades.
Okay.
So they withdrew from the joint venture. They were no longer part of the ownership of Atari Games at that point.
Ah, okay. So now, were you involved at all in the decision process to launch the Tengen line of NES games, or were you purely on the arcade side?
I was purely on the arcade side. I sat in the boardroom when they made those decisions, but I was not a decision maker. That was not part of it. Wasn't personally, I thought it was reckless, but I was neither innocent nor guilty in that thing. I literally had no involvement other than sort of hear about it from the inside. And hear the arguments pro and for it and everything else. But the boss wanted to do it. He was a Japanese. He was an ex-Namco guy, and called Nakajima. And Nakajima wanted to do this to assert his independence, both of Namco Japan, his half owners, and in a way of Warner in New York. And so they took this gamble, if you like, of doing these Tengen and other products and Tengen's products, but it didn't really work out that well.
No, it didn't.
So I was gone then in the early 1990, I think it was. I was out of Atari completely and into Namco, along with this small chain of amusement arcades that we had put together.
Okay, now the arcade operation, how was that run as a completely separate entity from the arcade game development side, or was there cross strategizing? How was the structure of the company built up at that point?
Yeah, they were the same. I mean, by 1993, I was in charge of both sides in the United States. In other words, the coin-op manufacturing side of it and the arcade. So that sort of answers your question. They were totally fused together.
Okay.
What we call Namco America. Namco America distributed the games in the United States, mainly Namco's games, and then Namco Operations, which was the arcade side of the business, was run from the same buildings basically. We started it by buying a small company in Savannah, Georgia called Barrel of Fun, and we kind of went from there and kind of bought a lot of other businesses, which of course turned out to be a huge strategic mistake. And we bought them cheap, but buying a business cheap isn't always the only thing,
Well, and by 1990, what does the arcade? Give us a brief overview of what does the arcade industry look like in 1990.
I can mainly talk from the United States point of view. It's still pretty good, we from 1992 to the mid 90s, we bought a number of other arcade companies, and they were mainly companies operating in malls, enclosed malls in the United States. And I think at our peak we had just under 500 arcades and operated, 25,000 games, something like that. We mainly operated in arcades, but we also had, game operations in movie theaters and water parks and you name it. Anywhere where young people were assembled, we had games in them.
Now, were you just selling in those non-Namco owned arcades? Were you just selling to operators or through distributors, or were you actually
bit of both?
Mainly
through distributors, third-party distributors. The equivalent in California of Leuven-at-the-Motten in Bingen, that kind of thing. These are mostly family-owned businesses. One or two in every big state, and places like North Dakota would be supplied out of Minnesota, all that kind of thing. We didn't. We sold them directly to these distributors. We also, to some of the bigger operators, the big volume guys, guys that had multiple units and arcades that we also competed with in the arcade business. We sold them games, which was always interesting because they were less inclined to buy from us if they could, than because they saw us as a competitor on the other side of on the business, on the operating side of the business. So they weren't too thrilled to buy from us, but mostly they did because we were one of the top 2 or 3 manufacturers there for a 10-year period, and they kind of had to buy from us.
And that does beg the question, what does the economics of that look like? I mean, you guys are running an arcade. Are you actually selling? Is the arcade manufacturing side of the company selling full price cabinets to the arcade operating side of the company? Are there? How does that work from a business standpoint?
Yeah, that was always a contentious point. I mean, first of all, we always wanted them to buy. Usually, most of the time, because inevitably you never had super hits all the time, but some of our more mediocre games, we would want them to, the operating side, to buy more, and they were willing to buy. So let's say there were a lot of negotiations. Sometimes we had to do some pretty sharp pricing. And I was in the middle of this, so I had to kind of straddle both sides, and it was problematic. But we made it work for quite a long time. But things changed then, of course. And you could see the writing on the wall from the mid '90s onwards. After Sony came out with the original PlayStation in '94, which was very good for Namco at the time, because some of the initial products. Ridge Racer is one I recall, and the fighting game Tekken, and all these kind of things were some of the start games of the PlayStation. We did very well with that, but it signaled kind of the beginning of the end of the arcade business, in the sense that sort of like jukebox and private stereo systems at home, from 30, 40 years before that, where the technology at home was as good, if not better, than the arcade thing. So it was always... so then from there we spiraled. We went off into what we call big games, the skiing game, Alpine Racer, all these kind of things that you couldn't easily do at home. In other words, you differentiated yourself by the controls and the kind of the environment, as opposed to the screen and the technology you could see on the screen, because the home games were just as good, if not better, beginning with PlayStation in the mid '90s.
Well, and that, I guess, leads to another question. The cost of those bigger units.
Yeah.
How was that dealt with? I mean, I can imagine that a lot of these mom and pop operators weren't going to be able to shell out, and I don't even know what the price range for something like an Alpine Racer was. What were we talking about, 10, 20 grand for a machine like that?
Yeah, I think it was nearer 10. Some of the other ones were maybe 12 to 15, but I think Alpine Racer, my recollection, it was around $10,000. I mean, it was a question of what the market would bear. It was a question of if the game was good enough. And Alpine Racer, when it came out, was a hot product. We couldn't make enough of them. Again, the volumes at that stage were much lower than they had been. And you're talking now in the mid '90s compared to the early '80s. It wasn't the same thing. It just wasn't. There weren't as many people. There weren't as many operators that could afford to buy those games, or more importantly, had locations that could justify the cost of them. It was one thing to buy a $1,300 Asteroids, but to buy a $10,000 Alpine Racer, that was a more limited market, profitable market, good market, but it wasn't anything like the good old days, if you like.
Gotcha. And at this point, was Namco doing any kind of development in the U.S., or was this purely a Japan-driven product pipeline?
We did very limited development in the United States. We just decided, again, it was a question of the economics of it from our point of view. The volumes in the coin-op business in worldwide wasn't... we didn't see it was justified as starting up a new coin-operated R&D thing. We did a limited amount. We produced a couple of games, none of them very successful. We more used third-party developers, some small companies that would come up with an idea and have a product. We might finance them to bring the thing to market. We manufacture it and give them, do a profit-sharing arrangement with them in some way. So we did all sorts of different deals. But essentially, yeah, that's about it.
Gotcha. Now, and this also begs the question, just like the accounting, if you will, between the arcade game development and the arcade operation divisions, what was the internal accounting like for the development costs, let's say, of a game like Tekken, which is developed for the arcades, but it appears almost simultaneously on the PlayStation?
Right.
And I'm guessing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing it was originally designed for release on both platforms. So from an accounting standpoint, from an internal logic of the company, was that just basically written off, split 50-50? Did the arcade side have to basically generate enough to cover the cost of development, and then the code is just handed over. But how was the logic working there?
Yes, you're asking me really how did Japan do it, because the way that Japan treated us was we were third parties. In other words, so my guy and I would deal with a salesman in Tokyo for Namco, and he would ask me, for example, buy 2,000 of this, commit to 2,000 of this particular game up front at X number of dollars. We always price in dollars. And, we'd have a negotiation and sort of work it out that way. Now, how the R&D was split at the what I would call Namco Limited level, was the Japan company, between the consumer businesses and the coin-op business, I honestly don't know. I don't know how they did that. They had two separate R&D divisions. There was a coin-op R&D and there was a consumer games R&D. And how they accounted for that, they never really released. They never told us that. And, frankly, it didn't really matter to us. It wasn't of any great interest. What mattered to us was what they were going to charge us for it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And how were you guys at all involved with the consumer division in the U.S.?
Only marginally. We shared at various times. We shared buildings with them, certainly in the early days, because after when in 1990 when Namco took the arcade business from Atari Games, we went into a building, and the consumer business kind of joined us almost at the same time into our building, because they were sort of a nascent startup business. Before that, Namco had done their consumer game business through third-party companies, classically through, Pac-Man was distributed by Bally Midway in Chicago, that kind of thing. They'd always had third-party, or even by Atari. In fact, it was by Atari, a lot of it too. Pole Position, for example, Final Lap, these products. But
when they really got big, I mean, Namco really is a name that becomes huge on the PlayStation. So they're selling this. Did you guys see the release of games like Tekken and Ridge Racer on the PlayStation by Namco itself as somehow a threat to the arcade operation, or was there some kind of coordination on release dates?
It was almost like the movie business, and it kind of merged it in a way. We would. Coin-op was like releasing to movie theaters sort of thing. Coin-op got the stuff at the start, maybe got a year's heads up, but that narrowed to where there was almost no difference at the end, because the consumer business dwarfed in the end the coin-op business. So it was a question of which was the more financially important. From our point of view, it was never good that this stuff was Tekken, Ridge Racer, all these things were being sold in the consumer business, because it hurt our business, and ultimately. We couldn't overcome it. It was sort of jukebox and records, kind of personal hi-fi systems, all that kind of thing, the exact same parallel. And in a way, it's sort of like movies and DVDs and streaming the same way. Eventually, all these kind of products resolve themselves into the home, and that's where the volume is done, not in amusement arcades or outside in movie theaters or whatever,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Looking at it from that point of view, what was it like? What were relationships with the non-Namco owned operators like? I mean, how did that relationship develop over the years? Let's say from 1990 through, let's say 96, 97.
It was sort of more of the same. Again, they had a basic disposition not to want to buy from us. If you were let's say you're a large operator in Texas, and you're competing against me, against Namco for amusement, for arcade locations in shopping centers and in malls. Well, why would you want to give the same company, and the same company, a different division of it, we used to always say, but they would go, yeah, right, sure. They didn't want to buy for us, and the only things they would buy from us when we had a very good value proposition, like an extremely good game, when they were forced to buy it. But by and large, it was, and we weren't the only ones. Sega was in the same position. Sega was trying to was operating as well, not as big as us. Excuse me. but they were a manufacturer and an operator also. We had a bigger problem because we were the biggest operator. But yeah.
Yeah. And I guess now that you bring those guys in, what was the relationship between the arcade game manufacturers during these years? I mean, was it open animosity? Was there sort of a gentlemanly live and let live? How did they interact with one another in the market?
They were just competitors, and it was whoever had the best game usually was doing better than the other. So the competition was at the level of who's got the best game. And it was a question of more and more. It became a question of only the A games could sell and the A plus games would sell. But in the early days, you could sell almost anything. But when it became more of a commodity, and there were lots of little Japanese companies still at this stage supplying games into the American market. I remember an American distributor saying to me, God, I wish a lot of these little companies wouldn't go away because I wouldn't have to buy samples from them all the time. I'm getting killed with all these samples, take two kind of thing. But if there's 20 of them, you can lose money pretty quickly. And I said to him, beware of what you wish for. You'll find that when you have no suppliers or far less suppliers, it's a worse situation, and that's what it resolved itself into. A lot of the small Japanese manufacturers fell away over time, just went out of business, and you're left with the Namcos and the Segas and Capcoms and Konamis and a few American companies towards the end of the 90s. But that was, again, that was a reflection of the volumes, because the volumes just weren't there anymore. Because people, by and large, the arcade games didn't, other than things like Alpine Racer, which was limited enough in how much you could sell, they didn't offer anything better than you could play Tekken just as maybe better and in a different way at home than you could in an arcade, yeah?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
So how long did you stay at Namco then?
I was at Namco from 1990 to 2008.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was there a long time, and then saw the kind of the upsides and the downsides and all the rest of it. And I got Nakamura, who was really the owner of Namco. He owned the vast bulk of the stock. He got old and he needed to sell out, so he sold out to. It was billed as a merger, but it wasn't a merger. It was Bandai, the games company in Japan, number 4 games manufacturer in the world or something like that. I don't know what the latest thing is. They bought Namco and they bought Namco not so much for their coin-op business as their consumer games business. We were just part of the package, if you like. They bought Namco. They just had a whole different attitude to the thing, and they weren't really interested in coin-op, and they didn't like. They wanted to have Japanese nationals. So once they bought us, my future was limited. I had a very close personal relationship with Nakamura. The politics of companies like this. Once he was sort of gone and phasing out, my days were numbered. So I think I lasted 3 or 4 years after Bandai, but then I got given the flick, as they say,
And what was I guess the industry had changed a lot by 2008. I mean, the mall arcades had not all died, but were pretty much gone.
Yeah, and we'd switched into this kind of, gambling in arcades wasn't permitted in Japan. There was no equivalent of Spielertax where there was, and the English, what they call AWPs, amusement with prizes. These were, quasi-gambling, low-stakes gambling kind of games. This wasn't really legal anywhere in the United States. So we did these prizes games, mostly mechanical games, and the whole industry sort of, and the operations almost went backwards in time, back to the pre-Pong days, if you like. Yeah, so we went back into these kind of mechanical games that, they were so-called skill games, that marginal skill kind of thing, and you'd win tickets that you could exchange for prizes. And it became that kind of, that was the old New Jersey boardwalk model, that you would, that's where that idea came from. That had persisted through the through the boom video games, it had always been a business. Most arcades hadn't really used that type of product. Most arcades were full of initially pinballs and then later almost exclusively video games. But we went sort of back to the future with the amusement with prizes product. I don't know if you're familiar with that. These machines.
I used to work in an arcade. Yeah, we had the claw machines and all that stuff.
Yeah, but Germany didn't do the kind of stuff they did in America because they had no need to. The Spielotheks had these, modified gambling games, and the English had those, and that was a better business. Real betting is always better than sort of false betting, if you like, from a money-making point of view.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Well, I mean, when I was a teenager in Germany in the 90s, you literally, unless you lived in one of the really big cities, there were no video game arcades you could access because the only coin-op video games were in the Spielotheks, and you had to be 18 to get into them. Because
they were mostly gambling.
Because they were mostly gambling. So I remember we snuck into one once just to play a Mortal Kombat machine because if they had carded us, we weren't going to be able to get in to play the game.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
So by the time you forced out of Namco, that whole video game arcade model had basically been replaced by the claw machines and everything else. Where do you go after 2008?
Me personally, I spent a couple of years with kind of on my own with a little company of my own called Five Bleu, and we imported a couple of games. We sort of did a deal with a small English manufacturer. Our most successful game was a gambling game called Poker Card, which was kind of really the Texas. There was a big fad for the Texas Hold'em poker game at that point, and this game sort of automated it all. It was a pretty slick product, but it really didn't have huge volume, didn't have huge success in the end. It was kind of lasted for a year or two. And at that point, I thought, okay, I've made a reasonable amount of money from this business. Do I want to keep staying in it? I was in my late 50s. I said, nah, I don't want to do this anymore. Plus, we had moved to Chicago. We had moved the whole business to Chicago because, it was one thing to run the business out of California when the business was really strong. Most of the business was on the East Coast because that's where the population of the United States lives, not the West Coast, so the volumes are on the East Coast. So, shipping costs and everything became important cost-wise. So we went to Chicago, which was the traditional home of the amusement game business going back to the, 20s and 30s or whatever. And, the pinball business, all that kind of thing. So we moved the business to Chicago, and, my wife didn't want to go, and I went there and lived by myself for a couple of years. And then in the end, I just came back to California in 2008, did my own little business for a couple of years. Didn't work out that well in the end. I kind of got out of it break-even basis, and I basically retired in 2010. So I've been retired for, 11 years now.
Not too shabby.
Well,
11 years of retirement and still being able to pay for it in this economy, that's already a success.
Well, yeah. I lived off the fat from the early 80s and into the mid 90s, I feel like. There was a lot of fat then, and I'm still living off it.
Hey, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was good fat.
It was good while it was good. and then it wasn't.
All I'm going to say is part of that fat is probably a lot of coins I dropped in machines back in the day.
Well, thank you very much retrospectively.
You're very welcome. So looking back on the industry as a whole, I guess, and this is one of always those big questions because the arcade industry as I knew it growing up in the 80s and 90s, and you experienced it on the business side. It died, and it's easy as a retrospective to be able to say, this was a model that was always going to fail at some point because of the home machines.
Right.
But at what point would you say internally inside the company and inside the industry, you guys sort of saw the writing on the wall? It may have still been a long ways away, but you saw the writing on the wall.
I think we did one big thing in 1992, 93. We bought Aladdin's Castle in 92, early 93. They were the largest operator of amusement arcades in the United States, and subsequently bought another company owned by Edison Brothers called Time Out, and a couple of other small chains. We became what the concept of we rolled up all the others, but. It was the thought was, and it was a common business practice at the time, to take a kind of a what they call a mature industry, or an industry, let's say, that's past its peak and then some, and you could achieve economies of scale by rolling it all up together. But it didn't work because almost immediately after that, and it's easy to be wise afterwards. We bought them cheap, yeah, but. 94, again, as I say, I think we saw the writing on the wall with PlayStation, and it was just a question of degree after that, to where, we were certain by the end of the 20th, certainly the very start of the 21st century, that the business essentially was kind of on a decline, on a terminal decline, not quite terminal. It was going to go back to being the scale of a business that it was in the pre-video game era, because video games weren't that big a factor anymore. They were still a factor, but they were just part of the mix in an amusement arcade, and there were just less spaces available for amusement arcades. Now, subsequently, since then, of course, everything has changed again, because these regional malls are all in decline as well, with the advent of online shopping, and accelerated by the pandemic in the last year. I mean, I don't have much contact with the people in Chicago anymore, but I imagine they're in severe distress at this point. Because,
Yeah, it's and the other big venue where you still see a lot of arcade games is in movie theaters.
Yes, and we
tend to have a little arcade.
And we had a big movie theater business. Towards the end of my time at Atari, our movie theater business was the growing part of the business. But it was a good little business, but it was never as good as a good arcade. You were always working. There's a big difference between having your space in an amusement arcade and a mall, and you pay rent, and maybe there's a little bit of profit sharing depending on your volume and stuff with the mall owner, but basically it's your business, whereas you're a kind of an afterthought in the movie theater. It's mostly third parties. Very few movie theaters operate their own games. There's third party operators like the Namcos of this world that operate the games for them and do a revenue share, but that was highly competitive and just not as profitable as the amusement arcade business was.
Yeah, I understand. Now, now there's a period in the early 90s when there was a bit of a conflict between the operators and the manufacturers over a thing called gray imports.
Yes.
So, or parallel boards, as they were called.
God, you really know your stuff. This is some arcane old stuff you've got here, but good. Okay.
What can I say? I like the weird little business stuff. I'm a lawyer with a business degree. This is the stuff that gets me going.
Yeah.
So, can you give me a brief description from the manufacturer's standpoint? What was that all about, and what effect did it have on the business?
Yeah, there was always that part of the business. There was always the business of what they call kind of leakage. So, in other words, even back in the 80s, and I've still got people who will tell me, oh, they found an Atari arcade in some little arcade in bumfuck Manitoba, that kind of thing. The games even migrated from Ireland, Europe into other markets like Canada and even the United States. But that wasn't mainly the thing. What happened, I think, is that gray market thing came about because it was the business was under more economic stress. The volumes weren't there, the revenues weren't there. So naturally, the operators tried to find cheaper ways to source the games. And sometimes, there's always market anomalies. There's always opportunities for arbitrage. You can find the game maybe for whatever reason is cheaper in Taiwan or Japan or somewhere else, and people would buy those. But as in most products, those games weren't licensed to be sold, quote, licensed to be sold in outside of the market into which they were intended. So there was always a conflict between, let's say, I had a game from Namco and I was selling it. But Namco had also sold the same game in Japan and all over the world. And for whatever reason, that game that should have been in Australia ended up in California. These grey imports. It was just a logical economic thing. If you could buy a game for $1,000 as opposed to the $1,600 or the $2,000 that I wanted, well, you'd buy it, assuming that the freight costs and all the rest worked out. But it was just an economic imperative to find a cheaper way. So that was all very logical. We weren't happy about it, but we understood what was happening with it. And in some cases, it worked for us. Sometimes we would help out maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but we would help out our own company by sort of turning a blind eye to it in some cases. And of course, it worked both ways. But rarely games went into Japan. The Japanese always kept their market pretty tight. There was very little of leakage that way, if you like. But there was a lot of leak. Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things I was always wondering about, and this is one of the things that it's hard for me to really get good information on, how long were the lead times or the release differences between Japan and North America or even Europe? I mean, because with console games, we were always used to, okay, we're going to get the game at least 6 months, sometimes a year or 2 years after it came out in Japan. What were those differences like, and how did those differences evolve over the years?
There was very little difference between the two. In fact, to the point where even from the earliest days, they were almost simultaneous. I would say there was nothing like 6 months because, again, it was a fashion product, and if you couldn't get it into the market, if you waited 6 months to bring it into the market, well, there would be a lot of leakage for one thing. The gray stuff would come over. But I would say that there were very few games that, for instance, both at Atari and Namco. Atari, when it was in Tipperary, related to Atari California, there might have been a month at most between the release in the United States and in California, and similarly in Japan, to sometimes where it was almost exactly the same.
Oh, really?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. But why would there be any difference? There was no logical reason to delay it, other than the fact that, maybe sometimes the game particularly suited America or something like that, so there was no rush for us to do the game. Yeah, we didn't see it as a great game for our market. That would be the only reason that I can think of that there would be a significant delay if indeed we ever made it at all. But no, there was never anything like 6 months or a year gap between releases of product. That just never happened. That
actually answers a big question that I've had for years, because
really?
Like I said, on the console side, it was more than common practice. I mean, hell, the consoles themselves were always a year delayed. The first one that wasn't was the PlayStation. So we were just used to those delays. And back in the day, you didn't know what was happening in the arcades in Japan because there was no real information out there.
Right.
So I guess in many ways it was always just an assumption I had that the same thing was happening on the arcade side.
I mean, I'm just thinking back now. I mean, there was obviously some gaps sometimes, and I think it was more in the early days. Now I come to think of, take a game like Pac-Man, for example. Pac-Man came out in this sort of, if I remember it was probably late spring, early summer of 1980 in Japan.
Yeah.
And I don't think Midway probably really shipped those, and probably until certainly the latter half of 1980. But that was more to do with the fact they didn't recognize it as a big game, as a top game, and it sort of crept up slowly kind of thing. It was a hit in Japan, but it wasn't a massive hit. And Pac-Man became a hit in America then, and then afterwards became a sort of a bigger thing worldwide. But after that, I think the release times were much less. That was an example of, there was a big gap. I think the early days you could say, yes, there was a bigger gap. But as the business got bigger in the early 80s, naturally enough, Midway would have people immediately trying to see every new product that Namco or any other third-party Japanese manufacturer would come up. They'd want it as quickly as they could. And a lot of the time, towards the end, they would, even though they had a third-party relationship, they would be shown games in development. And so they'd have a sense of what might be good and what might not be good. And, they'd be pushing for games that kind of made sense, and they'd want them quicker rather than later.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
I think so.
I have one final question that I ask of all of my interview subjects,
Right.
and it's sort of a two-part one. Looking back on your career and all the stuff that you've seen in the industry, what would be one thing, one trend, or one development in the industry that completely caught you by surprise? You didn't see it coming, that was very, very big. And what would be one that you thought was going to be huge and just flopped or didn't really pan out?
Well, the obvious one, and it has characteristics of both of those criteria that you set out, was the Laserdisc phenomenon. I mean, I think we all knew that it was a different kind of animal, and it really wasn't a game. It was kind of like playing a movie, but it had such an initial success. There was huge numbers from it. It was different. You got to remember at this stage there had been a lot of the regular video games, and people were looking for something new because the old standard video games had sort of had a difficulty, say from '83 onwards, and these Laserdisc games came, and we thought, man, this is going to be great, But there was a lot of skepticism too. But you felt you had to go with the trend, The trend is your friend kind of deal, and that looked like it was going to be something. Well, it didn't. There was all sorts of technical problems. We were using consumer players. God, I remember going over to Philips one time, and because we used to source the Philips Laserdisc players, and man, we had just such technical problems because we were using consumer video disc player, laser disc players for a heavy use, industrial kind of commercial use. That didn't work out. Plus the games themselves, in the end, had very limited gameplay value, as I'm sure you know. You probably played them, or did you?
Yes. They were one of the very first.
I'm talking about
I played. Dragon Slayer.
Space Ace.
Dragon Slayer, Space Ace.
Atari made their own one, the Clint Eastwood one, Firefox, based on with the movie. They had a niche, but that's all they were. And in the end, I think pretty much everybody lost more money than made any money on those things, just because of all the technical issues that came up afterwards.
Yeah.
So I don't have a good answer for you on that. That's the only one that I can think of. That kind of, but. You sound like maybe you have an angle to this too that you'd like me to explore or something.
No. It's literally one that I just sort of throw out there because sometimes people have that memory of that one big purchase that they made or they missed out on or something, and it's usually just jog the memory a little bit. But
I mostly remember the failures. The ones that you bought and you think 6 months later when you're trying to sell them to somebody in Germany or Italy or whatever, and they say, "You're kidding, I don't want that thing at any price." And you're left with a warehouse full of them, What are you going to do?
Oh, wow. Any particular titles that come to mind on that?
That soccer game that I told you about, this was the game that was modeled. This was modeled on the Atari's football game, which was a huge success. It was Atari's game when Taito had Space Invaders, and that was the big thing. But now the second game in the US at that stage, I'm talking about late '78, early '79. So we built this soccer game, and let's just say a lot of them were left unsold. It just didn't work out. And there was another game we bought from a company called Stern, who are still, that name is still in the business. They're the only pinball manufacturer left in the world, at least they were the last time I looked. We bought a video game from them called Mazer Blazer. You bet you've never heard of that.
You mentioned it, and I'm blanking on it completely. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it had this weird, awkward-looking control, kind of a giant flight stick, kind of awkward-looking arrangement. Anyway, we bought 1,000 of those. I always thought the deal was a bit funny, but then there were a lot of funny deals in these kind of things. What I mean by funny is that sometimes, I'll leave that alone.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's say deals weren't always done for the company. They might have been done for some other people.
Gotcha. You mean there's politics in this business now?
Well, or let's say individuals can make money and the company can't. Put it that way.
Ooh. That's,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So I leave that alone.
Okay. Well,
Just a couple more questions before I let you go. The amortization of cabinets, when you were running the Namco chain of arcades, how did you handle amortizing the purchase of an arcade cabinet?
I don't have a perfect memory of this, but my best memory that it was sort of 3 year straight line.
3 year straight line. Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, it went to zero after 3 years. If it was say $3,000, it was 2,000, 1,000 to zero.
Gotcha.
And we probably played with that a little bit for different types of equipment too. Particularly, I think when we went into the large machine area, the ski machines and the big driving machines, which tended to last longer, and probably we were towards at various times hunting for more profit. So we probably came up with some rationale. I don't have a perfect memory of this card, but we may well have extended some of the equipment, like those big machines, and some of the non-video games, the kind of ticket machine type games. They may have gone to 4 or even 5 year amortization. But
Okay.
I wouldn't like to swear to that in a court. I'd have to go back and dig up records, but roughly that's about it. And some things like when we bought kits, in other words, something to refresh a cabinet with, we would just whack those off straight away.
Really?
Depreciate them in a year. Yeah, I think so. Some things we did like that, but mostly I would say the bulk of our thing was 3 year straight line amortization.
Okay. And how well did that actually jive on average? Obviously, there's going to be big differences here, but did that jive with the actual life expectancy or earnings life of a cabinet?
I think it was probably, it depended on the cycle, at what time it was and over the years, but I would say on average it was fairly close to real life. I mean, we would have cabinets in there that were 4 or 5 years old, 6, 7, 8 years old, fully written off, still earning money. So, I mean, I think it fairly closely paralleled the real world.
Cool.
Yeah.
Now, and since you guys did have a larger chain that was not just a regional chain, not just a local chain.
We were in 46 states. We were
46 states.
We weren't in Alaska and we weren't in Hawaii because it was just too, we always considered ourselves to be in the furniture moving business to an extent. And moving, we were in Puerto Rico, quite big, but that was different. We had so much presence there. We had enough of a business there, Hawaii had a good local operator we couldn't compete with, and Alaska was too small. And then there were 1 or 2 other states at various times we weren't in, South Dakota or something like that. I know we had a store in North Dakota at one point.
Now, you say this is a phrase I've heard from other people in the coin-op business, the whole furniture moving business.
Yeah.
How do you make a decision how far to move equipment? At what point does it not pay off? How often did you have to cycle machines around in order to both maintain the profitability and at the same time the variety and the locations?
Yeah, it was mostly organized on a regional basis, just to cut down on the travel costs and all the rest of it. We weren't shipping games from sort of Maine to Southern California very often. That didn't work. So it was, we were regional managers and they had a lot of authority as to how they moved games around in the area.
Okay.
And, they tracked the numbers and they had help from head office, or at least that's what head office would say. The regional guys would probably say no. But, we worked it that way. And, I mean, no one liked doing it because it's a lot of work, physically getting them out of there and getting them back in, and always potential for damage when you move them. game's been sitting there for a couple of years, and suddenly you find problems with it once it moves. So, by and large, you try not to do that, particularly the big games. But, we moved them, and mostly with rental trucks. We just rented trucks locally and move them. We had a few big trucks that would do big moves, every now and then. We'd have coast to coast stuff and everything. We had a fairly big warehouse in Chicago. But, our kind of philosophy was, don't bring games back to head office to a warehouse. Keep them out there, because every time they get in a warehouse, it gets hard to get them out of there for various reasons, and try to fix them in the field. That kind of thing was the basic philosophy.
Gotcha. And I'm still a little bit curious, because you're trying to keep the machines on site. Obviously, you have regional managers who are making these decisions, but I'm also guessing that you have local managers who, of course, may be trying to fight over, we need an extra couple of these big hot games, or we're not getting the newest games fast enough. Was there that kind of politics within the chain?
Yeah, there was. And, we had roughly a kind of ABC designation of arcades. In other words, pretty much any good game that came out, the A arcades got them immediately. And, as you went down the food chain to the B, C, and, probably we had some D type locations, they really got mostly leftovers, or, they'd get something after a year that had burnt out in an A or B location. And I would say, I think we were reading stuff, and it got easier, but when in the era of when it became less of video, it was a bigger thing when the business was mainly video games and not so much the skill with prizes games. So with the skill with prizes, the ticket type games, or the cranes and all that kind of stuff, they tended to stay in situ more. They didn't move around. They didn't need to move as much because the customer was primarily trying to win tickets, and the game was almost secondary. It wasn't the main part of it. The ticket was as important as the machine itself, if you like, whereas video games is just you play it and it's all about the pleasure of the game as opposed to getting any kind of prize. Do you see my point?
Yeah, I totally get it. Totally get it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Right. And were those ticket machines and stuff, I can imagine that there were certain locations where that would be far more profitable or more appropriate. Was that also something that was considered? Did you identify an arcade as being one that would have that clientele versus a more hardcore clientele?
There were very few, what I would call it. Most of the mix in most arcade was roughly kind of the same. There wasn't a video only location or a skill with a prize machine type only mentality ever. I don't think those we never had anything like that. We had various mixes, and if the mixes were slightly different from place to place, that was just part of the furniture moving process. Some of the time, sometimes you'd end up with more or less of the skill with prizes games as opposed to video games, and pinballs a little bit too.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah. Now, one of the bigger trends, especially early 90s, all the way through pretty much I don't want to call it the death, but sort of the nadir of the video game, was the one-on-one fighting game craze. Started off by Street Fighter 2.
Yes.
How did that change the mechanics and the mix of machines in an arcade?
I don't think it changed it radically. There was just more of them. Whatever you went with, whatever was cool at the time. Street Fighter 2, we had a particular example. I was running manufacturing at Atari when Street Fighter 2 came out. And Atari, I don't know if a lot of people don't know this, but the Atari engineers designed the cabinetry in the United States for Street Fighter 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we had this deal. We were dealing with Sugimoto of Capcom, and the circumstances kind of evade me now. This was the late 80s.
Mid to late 80s. 91.
Was it 91? Okay, all right. Well, somewhere around there. I know we got involved in manufacturing those things, but Street Fighter 2 to me was as much it was the sort of there had been a period where there were a lot of games in non-arcade locations, and Street Fighter 2, but that all sort of died off after the kind of early, say by 83, 84, that began to sort of go into a tailspin. But Street Fighter 2 was a game that suddenly started reappearing in 7-Elevens and all that kind of stuff, in a fairly big way. So they were there in non-arcade street locations quite a lot. And, in other words, arcades didn't have that kind of fighting game uniquely. That game sort of appealed to a lot of people and ended up in multiple locations. So, we had shortly after that, then, we had Tekken, which was a pretty big fighting game of its time. Not a Street Fighter 2, but it was a big game. And there was a number of others. If that was the hot game, we had more of them, I guess, is the simple answer to that.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering whether or not from a coin drop standpoint, it changed the dynamic since it was less about...
You mean it earned more and up the numbers in general or something?
Well, it was also the issue that it wasn't about playing it with other people against the computer, which a lot of games had. This was more people fighting against each other. Was there a change in the dynamic of maybe discouraging some people from coming in, or the competitive nature of the game? Did that change the coin drop mechanic?
No, not to my memory, not significantly. I don't have any I don't have any particular insight on that, Carl. No.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Finally, if at all, did the so I've talked to operators before, and they were talking about how in the 80s, once a machine stopped earning, you basically drove it off to the dump. Did the resale market to collectors or private individuals ever become a real issue for the Namco chain?
No, we sold directly off our website, in later years, and both to operators and to private collectors and that kind of thing. But we had, such as I said before, we had this ABC, even D kind of location. So we had we used our games a lot. They went down the chain, if you like, A to B to C to D kind of sort of system. So we kind of really, by the time we were finished with the games, a lot of the time, there wasn't much left. They were pretty beat up. Yeah.
That's a nice way of putting it, probably.
It isn't to say we towards the end we had a full-time guy selling machines though too, strategically, and we were certainly selling to a lot to street operators and smaller arcade chains. We were doing that, and some of that was more in the era where we started to trim back, and at our peak we had almost 500 arcades and I don't know, 30,000 machines, 30,000+. I don't even remember now. So that was peak, but then we started pulling back from that as the business sort of turned in the mid 90s. And so I think we got more active, and the advent of the internet in the mid to late 90s allowed us to sort of sell the things directly from the website fairly efficiently. And people could go in and pick games, and we had prices right on them and everything. And, I think we had one or two people just working full time, just selling games like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I actually do remember seeing those price tags on the games at a Namco arcade at some point in the late 90s. Would have been 98, 99, something like that.
It was always there. And yet we always had a thing at Christmas, around Christmas, those kind of times we would stick these ludicrous prices on the games and see if anyone would bite, like something that that might be really worth $1,500. Well, at Christmas, we'd stick it in as $2,500 or $2,000 or something like that. Yeah, we didn't sell a lot, but it was quite profitable in a very limited way.
Gotcha. Yeah, I do remember looking at those prices, just shaking my head, going, "Who the hell is buying these things at those prices?"
Yeah. Well, it was kind of like we were reluctant sellers when we were doing that. It was great if we made a big profit, where we weren't going to get rid of them for marginal profits. It wasn't worth our while to do it.
Gotcha.
And of course, the arcade, there was always a struggle because the arcade managers got a cut of the sale price, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, they wanted to drop the prices, so there was always this tension,
Mm.
Getting 10% of $1,000 for sure is better than possibly getting 10% of $2,000 when hardly anyone's going to buy it. You might be one guy, or there might be nobody will buy it.
Gotcha.
So always,
Yeah, makes
I'm not
sense.
sure if I said 10%. I'm not sure we gave them that much. I can't even remember now, but it was significant enough for these relatively low-paid guys to be interested in trying to make sales.
Gotcha. Now, I have one more question, and this is relating back to your time at Atari Ireland.
Yes.
So, you guys were assembling, manufacturing the games. Now, how much, or I should say, how much of your work there was basically building inventory for sale, and how much was build to order once actual orders came in?
I would is that I'm pretty clear on this, that it wasn't built to order. It was very much, we would just the mechanics of the thing is, let's say we would take a game, and if we thought highly of it, we'd say, let's build 1,000, 2,000 of this. That's the kind of numbers you were talking about, And if it did well, then we would increment another number, but it was never based on forward orders. It didn't work like that. People, our customers, the distributors, mainly, and some of the other arcade chains, they'd wait to see how the thing did. So there was no real way of efficiently doing it based on an order in advance basis. We took the risk. We speculated how many we were going to sell. If we got that number wrong, we were left with inventory. It was just like that, and we had to dump them, sell them cheap, or whatever.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Okay, yeah, that's all the follow-up questions I had. But
one of the crucial things in the video manufacturing thing was what we call releases. The release number. You could really hurt yourself if you under or over release, particularly over release more than even under release. Under release, you just didn't make the profits, but over released, you could make big losses.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, because we are talking about relatively expensive equipment. I can't imagine the margins for you guys were all that high if you were buying the boards from California.
No, well, they left some money for us, because don't forget at that time, and it was a struggle, between as it usually is between parent and subsidiary company as to who take the profits. But Irish corporate profits tax were very, very well. Actually, were nothing at that time for exports. They subsequently changed it to 12.5%. But so there was a big incentive at the financial level in the company to sell the games, the boards cheaply to Ireland, so we would have less taxes to pay as an aggregate corporation. But then inevitably there was tension between the divisions of the company as to how that worked in real world.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Cool. I gotta ask, just a sideline, that deal between Atari and Capcom, was it actual assembly of the Street Fighter II cabs, or was it just a design?
They didn't have it. We designed it and manufactured them. We manufactured this kind of there was a large version of it with a kind of, I remember it was they called it the deluxe model or something. It was a larger version of Street Fighter II. The president of Atari at the time, a guy called Nakajima, who was an old Namco guy. He was very close to Kenji Tsujimoto, the Capcom boss. And I think that's where the deal came from. They didn't have a factory, and they didn't have cabinet designers, if you like. And I guess they wanted to make a bit of a splash. And actually, I think we made the way I remember, it was a pretty ugly cabinet, but Capcom liked it.
Oh, it was that weird one with some weird nondescript pattern, and it was purple and yellow and stuff on the sides.
Yeah, maybe. I just remember it had a very big, I can't think of the word for it now, but where you rested your hand where the joystick was, all that kind of thing was fairly large. It was bigger than, in my opinion, what it needed to be. It just had an impact. And Americans like those kind of big things. And they could charge more than the extra cost, if you like, yeah. charging
Yeah.
premium for those kind of things. They were mainly meant for arcades as opposed to the smaller cabinets that sold the volume and were in street locations.
The fighting game trend just seemed to have changed the mechanics of how much money people were spending in the arcade and the speed of it. That's why I was always wondering if it really did add up to a difference, or it was just people were done with their gaming faster.
No, I mean, I think the impact of Street Fighter 2 was really in the non-arcade locations as opposed to the arcades. I don't think it made any. I'm not sure this is the same point we're talking about here as you just made, but no. Street Fighter 2 was very popular in America, at least in the kind of the 7-Elevens of this world. The kind of in the overall business, the from an operating point of view, Street Fighter 2 had much more impact in non-arcade locations in the United States than it did in arcades. In other words, as an example, the Street Fighter 2 might have ended up in a lot of them ended up in 7-Elevens and places like that, and a lot of the sales were to non-arcade locations, real street and bars and whatever.
Why
whereas they were
that was?
Because it was so popular, and I mean, that was reflective of kind of sort of the early 80s as well, too, when a lot of, the Pac-Mans and stuff like that ended up in the proverbial dentist lobby. Now, mind you, I never saw one in a dentist lobby, but you heard all these kind of stories of them ending up in those kind of places. But I don't think Street Fighter 2 ever made it to a dentist lobby. But no one ever said that. No, I guess my point, Street Fighter 2 specifically didn't impact arcades in a huge way as much as it impacted revenues of street operations, non-arcade locations.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it makes sense just because, it was one of those games that really was everywhere. I remember seeing it in convenience stores.
Exactly.
It was huge. I mean,
yeah.
But I didn't know Atari had a piece of that, so that's actually interesting.
It was a small piece. You never make money making somebody else's games, not in the same way as selling your own proprietary products, your own IPO, your own IP rather. Yeah,
but still, interesting.
I mean, it was good for us, but it just if you were a street operator, and the word street has been repeated here, but if you were a street operator, Street Fighter 2 had a much bigger impact on you than an arcade operator.
That's all I've got. Yeah.
I got a miniature Buenos Aires. Well, kind of Buenos Aires. I can connect Buenos Aires to Atari now for you.
Oh, really?
Well, actually, well, in a kind of an obscure kind of way. Apart from the fact that the distributor down there was a big customer of ours, Jorge. They called him George Machowski.
Machowski.
Yeah,
I've run across that name again and again, and I've even sent emails to him. I want to get an interview with this guy.
Yeah, he was the guy that he had the coin kind of thing, the system for non-coin operating.
The cards. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, the cards thing. Yeah, but this other story is different. This is different. When we built our cabinets originally in Tipperary, when we got our cabinets, we got them from a company called Murray Kitchens. And Murray Kitchens, we actually bought one of their plants afterwards, and they've gone out of business since. But the owner of that one, we bought them out for I'm going to say about $2 million in the early 80s, which was quite a lot of money for back then, for this kind of rinky-dink little plant, if you like, that he'd fully written off. But he ended up in Buenos Aires, and his son had an Irish bar and whatever. I think he still lives there in Buenos Aires, Jack Murphy and his son.
Oh, that's cool.
It was called the Shamrock Bar or something. You always think it was financed by Atari Games. That's how they...
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So how much did you actually deal with the international distribution, like in South America?
Well, we did, and this was one of our great mistakes. And not so much with the Argentinians were good, and they were always honorable, and they paid their bills and stuff. But when the business started booming, we had done most of our business via third parties. American export-import firms that would specialize in dealing with South America, particularly a company called R.H. Bellum in New York. Mark, God, I can't think. Mark Haim, Haim. We kind of made a fatal mistake of deciding, no, we don't need to give him more margin. We'll start selling the stuff ourselves. So we started selling, and we sold into South America for several years. But then we got really stung by these assholes in Brazil who stiffed us for $500,000 and whatever. And it was our fault, our mistake. We should never have extended that much credit. But I always cringe when I think of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't even remember their name now. I guess I put them out of my mind, And it was one of those things where it just was, the cost of going through the legal system to try and recover it was, in the end, we decided we're not going to get this. This is just we're going to spend money on lawyers, and we're going to spin our wheels, and they're going to beat us in the local ground and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas the import-export guys knew how to handle that better, than we did. I guess it was an expensive education for us.
Mm. Yeah, as somebody who grew up in South America,
yeah,
I
bet you can appreciate that.
Oh, more than you can possibly imagine.
I still remember being down in Sao Paulo, having meetings with these guys, and it was such a culture shock to me to go to the meetings in the guy's house, and then the guy's house would be like South Africa, surrounded by wire and big fences and all this stuff, I guess because of crime and whatever.
Yeah. Sao Paulo is really, really bad.
Right.
A guy I grew up with, he was working there for years. He does IT for a lot of big companies. Right now he's at Adidas and their international headquarters in Panama. But he lived there for years, and he said, it got so bad that him, his wife, and his kids, they literally couldn't leave the street they were on. Like there was guards at the beginning and the end of the street, the block, and you never left the block unless you were in your car, and then it was just to go to work and shopping, and that was it because it was just too dangerous.
Yeah, I know. I remember we staying in a hotel in downtown Sao Paulo, and a fancy, I can't remember the name of the hotel, but it was an upmarket kind of hotel. Most of the people were staying there. Business was good then, and they would always tell us, don't go walking out in the streets too much, in downtown.
Yeah, it's, Brazil, beautiful place. I've been there several times, but it's one of those things where the crime and the poverty in the country is so bad.
Yeah, and the inequality as well, too. That's the thing that I hate most about South America in general. Central America, I guess, more so. Argentina wasn't as bad, I think, but Brazil was really bad.
Yeah, Argentina wasn't as bad. It's gotten bad in the last 20 years. Really
Has
bad
it really?
in the last 20 years.
Hey, Kevin, thank you so very, very much. This has been extremely enlightening and insightful. And it's basically pulled the curtain back a little bit on this industry.